Christian Empire did not fall. It transformed into the invisible architecture of the modern world. In 313 CE, Christianity moved from a persecuted belief to an imperial tool, permanently changing how political power justified itself across the entire Western civilizational structure. Constantine used the Roman Empire's vast administrative power to fuse his faith with state authority. This act redefined obedience not as a civic choice, but as a sacred duty, binding the subject's soul to the emperor's will through the institution of the church. This is History and Society, where we explore how systems quietly shaped civilizations long before people understood what was happening. Belief became law after the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE, which turned abstract theology into a concrete mechanism of governance. This decree established a new system where religious orthodoxy was inseparable from political loyalty, creating a powerful tool for social control. The Emperor Theodosius made Nicene Christianity the official state doctrine of the Roman imperial system. His actions ensured that religious dissent was now a political crime, allowing the state to persecute heretics with the full force of law and military power. Rome was sacked by the Visigoths in 410 CE, a catastrophic military failure for the Western Empire. However, the Christian institutions within the city, particularly the church, survived the political collapse intact, preserving their organizational structure and growing influence amidst the chaos. The theologian Augustine reframed this devastating loss through the conceptual framework of the church. He shifted popular loyalty away from the crumbling temporal empire toward an eternal divine order, arguing that the city of God was the only true and lasting home. The last Western emperors vanished from the historical record by 476 CE, leaving a profound power vacuum across Europe. Bishops, however, remained as stable figures of local authority, stepping in to become the de facto administrators of civic life and social stability. Pope Leo I skillfully filled the imperial gaps left by the retreating state, using the Western Church as a new form of civic authority. He negotiated with invaders and managed public services, demonstrating that papal power could replace functions once held by Roman governors. The Church began to formally assume civil functions abandoned by the collapsing Roman bureaucracy around 590 CE. It took over tasks like grain distribution, public works, and diplomacy, embedding itself as an essential part of the secular administrative machinery of post-Roman territories. This system was perfected by Gregory the Great, who governed a struggling Italy through the expanding papal system. He acted as a de facto ruler, using the church's resources and network of officials to organize defense, feed the populace, and enforce social order. Imperial power reappeared in Western Europe by 800 CE, but it was legitimized through religious coronation, not by the force of Roman legions. This marked a fundamental shift, where secular rule now required divine endorsement to be considered valid and absolute by its subjects. The ruler Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope, creating the Holy Roman Empire through an explicit act of Christian legitimization. His authority was built on a partnership with the Church, which provided the ideological glue for his vast and diverse European territories. Christian authority itself fractured during the Great Schism in 1054 CE, a division that paradoxically multiplied its influence instead of weakening it. The split created two competing centers of power, each seeking to expand its own sphere of control and ideological reach. Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople and Pope Leo IX excommunicated one another, formalizing the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. This event institutionalized two rival Christian empires, each with its own theological justifications and political ambitions for dominance across the known world. Faith was used to mobilize mass violence across continents after the Council of Clermont in 1095 CE. The call to crusade demonstrated that religious belief could be weaponized to direct huge populations toward a common military objective, transcending local and feudal loyalties. Pope Urban II initiated this new era by weaponizing religious belief through the powerful crusading system. He channeled the aggression of European nobles outward, using the promise of salvation to justify military campaigns aimed at reclaiming territory in the Near East. Church courts, known as ecclesiastical courts, rivaled the power and reach of secular kings by 1200 CE. These legal bodies held jurisdiction over wide areas of civil life, including marriage, inheritance, and contracts, making the church a dominant legal force across Europe. The Pontiff Innocent III dominated European politics through the sophisticated papal legal structure he commanded. He used tools like interdicts and excommunication to bend kings to his will, demonstrating that the church's authority was superior to that of any secular monarch. The practice of mandatory confession became a powerful tool of social discipline and information gathering by 1300 CE. This system allowed the church to monitor the private lives of its flock, enforcing moral codes and identifying dissent at the most personal level. The philosopher Thomas Aquinas provided the intellectual justification for this system, rationalizing state and church authority through Christian scholastic institutions. His work synthesized faith and reason, creating a theological framework that legitimized the existing social and political hierarchy as divinely ordained. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517 CE, shattered the religious unity of Western Christendom. However, it ultimately preserved Christian dominance in politics by transferring authority from the universal church to newly empowered national and state-level religious institutions. The reformer Martin Luther challenged the authority of Rome, but in doing so, empowered secular state churches under the control of German princes. His movement inadvertently strengthened the fusion of religious identity with national identity, laying the groundwork for modern sovereign states. Religion no longer ruled Europe directly after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 CE, but it now defined the very nature of sovereignty. The treaty established the principle that each state's ruler would determine its official religion, embedding Christian divisions into the state system. The Westphalian rulers, who signed the treaties, embedded Christian norms and moral assumptions into the nascent nation-state system. This framework made religious affiliation a key component of statehood, shaping international relations and internal governance for centuries to come. A new language of universal rights emerged from deep theological roots with the English Bill of Rights in 1689 CE. Concepts of liberty and justice, previously discussed in religious terms, were now being framed as inherent political principles, though still shaped by Christian thought. The philosopher John Locke successfully secularized Christian morality, embedding it within the framework of constitutional government. He transformed concepts like divine law into natural law, providing a philosophical foundation for rights that appeared universal but retained their Christian ethical structure. Divine legitimacy was rewritten as self-evident natural law by the time of the American Declaration of Independence in 1776 CE. The language of God-given rights provided a moral justification for revolution, replacing the authority of a king with a higher, yet still transcendent power. America's founding elites carefully preserved Christian ethics inside new republican institutions, even while advocating for religious freedom. Their vision of a virtuous republic depended on a citizenry guided by a moral code that was fundamentally derived from Protestant Christian values. The French Revolution directly attacked the Catholic Church as an institution of the old regime in 1789 CE. Yet, in its effort to create a new society, the Revolution kept the Church's moral framework, promoting virtues like fraternity and civic duty. Revolutionary leaders in France reused Christian categories of sin, redemption, and universal truth inside the machinery of the modern state. The cult of the Supreme Being, for example, attempted to replace Catholic dogma with a secular religion that mirrored its structure. Empires began to rule without priests, but with distinctly Christian moral codes by 1800 CE. Colonial expansion was often justified not by direct religious mandate, but through a civilizing mission rooted in a sense of cultural and moral superiority. British administrators in India and Africa expanded their authority through the imperial civil service, a system guided by Victorian Christian ethics. They implemented laws and social reforms that reflected their own moral assumptions, reshaping societies to fit a Western Christian-inflected model. The old European empires fell after the Great War concluded in 1918 CE, but their shared Christian moral order survived the collapse. The New World Order was envisioned not as a rejection of old values, but as a more perfect expression of them. President Woodrow Wilson framed his vision for global politics, including the League of Nations, through a distinctly Christian-inflected liberalism. His 14 points were built on ideals of self-determination and universal justice that had deep roots in Protestant social thought. The language of universal human rights replaced theology without fundamentally changing its underlying structure after 1945 CE. The concept of inherent human dignity, central to this new discourse, was a secularized version of the Christian idea of the soul's sacredness. Post-war institutions like the United Nations embedded these Christian ethical assumptions into the new global system of governance. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights codified a moral vision that was presented as universal, but was shaped by centuries of Western Christian development. Secularism rose as a dominant ideology in the West around 1960 CE, but it depended heavily on unstated Christian assumptions. The separation of a church and state did not erase the moral and ethical frameworks that Christian civilization had built over centuries. Western governments continued to govern through moral frameworks that were born directly from Christian history. Concepts of justice, charity, and individual worth remained central to public policy, even as their religious origins became less visible and were rarely acknowledged openly. Overt religious belief lost much of its public visibility, but retained its structural influence by 2000 CE. The logic of Christian thought continued to operate beneath the surface of secular institutions, shaping laws, social norms, and political debates in subtle ways. Political leaders across the Western world consistently invoked shared values shaped by the Christian civilizational system, often without naming their source. Calls for compassion, forgiveness, and community were secular echoes of foundational religious teachings that still resonated with the public. Religious language re-entered global conflict narratives with new intensity after the attacks of September 11, 2001 CE. The framing of a war on terror often relied on a binary moral logic of good versus evil, echoing older religious and crusade-era rhetoric. Western states framed these new wars through a language of moral universals and human rights, concepts rooted in Christian ethics. Intervention was justified as a duty to protect the innocent and spread freedom, a modern iteration of the civilizing mission of past empires. By 2020 CE, Christianity no longer ruled openly, but its logic continued to structure the basis of political legitimacy. A government was considered legitimate if it upheld rights and values that, while presented as secular, were products of a long Christian intellectual tradition. Modern institutions, from courts to parliaments, preserved Christian logic within their secular governance models. The very idea of a universal law that applies to all people, a core tenet of modern legal systems, mirrors the Christian concept of a single, universal divine law. Faith appears almost entirely absent from public power in 2025 CE, while silently directing its application through inherited assumptions. Debates over justice, ethics, and human dignity continue to follow paths first carved by centuries of theological and moral reasoning. Legislators and courts enforce moral assumptions that are inherited directly from Christian tradition, even when they believe their reasoning is purely secular. The deep structure of Western law continues to reflect a specific moral architecture built over 2 millennia of history. Across 1,700 years of history, the machinery of empire did not vanish. It simply transformed its appearance. The centralized, visible power of Rome gave way to a decentralized, invisible authority that operated through ideas and institutions rather than legions and governors. Christian authority successfully migrated from the bodies of emperors and popes into abstract systems of law, ethics, and belief. This allowed it to survive the fall of states and the rise of secularism, becoming a permanent and often unnoticed feature of power. The Christian empire, therefore, did not truly fall. It dissolved into the very structures of modern Western civilization. Its logic was absorbed into our concepts of law, our understanding of rights, and our assumptions about what constitutes a just and legitimate society. Modern power, whether it acknowledges it or not, operates inside a world order shaped by a Christian blueprint. The empire became an atmosphere, an invisible operating system that continues to run in the background, shaping the choices of a world that thinks it is free.